Forgiveness. It's difficult. Why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult for us to forgive? Sometimes it just feels better to hang on to anger and resentment and carry that around with us like a badge on our shirts, versus turning towards act of forgiveness that will ultimately lead us into new life. We seem to have this desire first to make sure that the other person gets their due, and then maybe we'll forgive. But of course, the thinking is flawed, because even if someone does get what is deserved, we just keep on walking around with the same anger and resentment, forgetting to let go of it, forgetting that we're called to forgive. Forgiveness is one of those things that leads us into a more compassionate understanding of others. And it's the way that we seek to grow into walking in the way of love. Forgiveness is, in short, part and parcel of the Christian life. Last week, the gospel lesson featured Jesus telling the disciples a formula for what is done when someone sins against you. And he gives them this formula to address conflict in community. And if you read the passage from last week, you'll notice a couple of things. And the first is that nothing about the process Jesus describes is anonymous. It follows this shape. First, confront the person that has hurt you, that has wronged you. If the person doesn't listen and doesn't seek healing and reconciliation, then take another member with you and confront the person again. And if that still doesn't work, then tell it to the community. The pattern Jesus gives is helpful in that it focuses on relationship, on seeking out relationship, even with someone who has wronged another. And it is inviting us to remain in relationship even in the moment of this offense that has happened. And there's some nuance that we need to tend to with that, but in the main, it's a helpful pattern for addressing conflict in a community. And this morning we pick up in the same chapter. It's the very next verse. And so Jesus has given them this whole pattern about forgiving, and then Peter pipes up and says, yeah, but wait a minute. How many times do I have to forgive? And it's a little ironic that Peter is the one that asked this, because of course, as astute readers of the gospel, we all know that it's Peter that's going to need forgiveness, I don't know, somewhere around the moment of crucifixion. But he asks this question: Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And of course, Jesus says not 7 times, but 77 times. Jesus is trying to tell us that forgiveness is part of the pattern of a cruciform life, a life of faith, hope, and love. That living a life patterned after Jesus demands forgiveness be part of how we live. It's at the center of what it means to love each other. And when practiced as regularly as Jesus suggests in saying not 7 times, but 77 times, it is to say that it becomes a way of being, of remaining in relationship. It becomes part of the pattern of how we pray and how we love. We just finished a confession asking for God's forgiveness for those moments in our lives when we have fallen short of honoring God's goodness in ourselves, in each other, and in God's creation. And of course, Peter, as an example of what this looks like, is pretty helpful. Because in the crucifixion narrative, Peter is unwilling to honor his relationship with Jesus. And of course, we all know that Peter denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. And yet, he's forgiven. He's offered very gracious, compassionate, merciful forgiveness that is beyond our imagination. And so we have to start asking a few different questions. Peter is very unaware in the moment today, in the gospel narrative today, of what's going to happen when it comes time for Jesus' crucifixion. He's blissfully unaware of how he is going to be in need of this forgiveness that is beyond our imagination. And that begins to ask, to kind of press us to look at our own lives and to ask, are we aware of all of the ways that we hurt others? Are we always aware of the impact of our actions on the lives of our neighbors? Are we able to see clearly how my participation in certain systems creates more pain and hurt for other peoples? How is it that I can become more aware of the ways that I sin against another? And can I become as aware of my capacity to sin against another as I am of others' capacity to sin against me? The practice of forgiveness is a practice of love. And our willingness to enter into this never-ending pattern of forgiveness is how we begin to live with love at the center of our being. It's important to understand that our willingness to forgive is a recognition of the many ways that I first have received forgiveness. Forgiveness from God. The countless times that God grants me forgiveness for those many ways that I fall short of that cruciform life. And when I forgive, I'm sharing that same mercy and compassion that God has shared first with me. I'm not giving up anything when I forgive another. I'm not any less than I was before. I'm simply sharing that boundless loving kindness of God. And I may, in fact, find that my life is filled with more joy, more love, more mercy. I may find that I'm able to move forward and able to heal from the pain of the past when I turn my heart towards forgiveness. And I think it's important to say that sometimes the path to forgiveness is also needs to be practiced from a distance. That sometimes there's hurt and trauma that is so great that I can't practice forgiveness up close and personal. I have to remove myself from the hurt. Of course, it's easy for us to think of abusive relationships, of any number of awful examples in which the trauma has been too much for forgiveness to be practiced right there in the flesh. That the person has to seek to care for themselves first. The injury to my personhood may be too much. And it may not be me that's able to offer forgiveness. Instead, I have to rely on God to be the one to grant a forgiveness that is needed. And I think in this situation, it's also forgiveness for myself and for that person who has created such trauma. And it may be that I need to find a counselor or spiritual director to help me find that path towards healing. And that I might have to create distance between me and another, to invite God into that distance, to grant the forgiveness that is necessary. Forgiveness is difficult. It invites us to place God at the center of our being. And God invites us into living out that cruciform life of Christ, a life of faith, hope, and love. And as with all difficult things, forgiveness only gets easier when I practice it. It's only by forgiving that I learn how to forgive more readily and with more, recognizing the multitude of ways that God forgives and able to forgive. And it is by turning towards this practice of forgiveness, of extending God's love in this way, time and again, that I grow more and more into the of the stature of Christ.